Welcome to another More Than Walking video podcast discussion, where we seek to encourage dialogue on a variety of topics with the unique perspectives of people with spinal cord injuries and other disabilities. It is our goal for these conversations to make us think critically and for us to all lead with a newfound sense of belonging in a world where we have more things in common than we do different. Tonight's discussion is Handcuffed and Handicapped, inmates of a prison within a prison. And I'm your host, Fees, an inspiring artist here in the great state of Connecticut. And before we even get into our discussion tonight, I'd like to thank my good friend, Jamal Johnson, who is a personal injury and criminal defense lawyer here in the greater Hartford area. And if anybody out there who happens to be in Connecticut and is looking for some type of legal defense, we'll post something down in the video with links to where he's at and his contact information if you're looking for representation. Yeah, no problem. You're very welcome, man. So just briefly, everybody just introduce yourself and then we'll get into tonight's discussion.
I'll go first. My name is Scott Roberts from Minnesota. I am a SCI C2, C4 incomplete as of 2020.
Nice. Glad to have you on, Scott.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Jonathan Sigworth. I'm a C7 complete and since 2006, hailing from Connecticut.
I'm attorney Jamal Johnson. I'm a private attorney out of Connecticut and with a concentration in personal injury and criminal defense law.
My name is Maurice Armand. I'm a paraplegic ever since 1999. My level is a T8. So underneath my chest, down, I have no sensation. I drive. I live by myself, but I was always taught from my other homie that was in a wheelchair. Life still goes on, no matter the situation. As long as God wake me up every morning, I was meant to be here. You know what I'm saying? So, with that being said, I went to the feds I did 10 incarcerated and 4 on probation. And I mean, it could have been worse than what it was, being that I'm in a wheelchair, but I had a strong family with me, and everything was good with me. And like I said to any other paraplegics out there, never give up, man. Never give up. As long as you waking up every day, man, never give up.
I'm Colleen Lord. I'm a board member with NAMI Shoreline and Stop Solitary, Connecticut. And my personal experience is my son was killed 3 years ago in Whaley Jail by actions of COs. Wow. So where I see a lot of progress, not a lot, but beginning with CIT training, additional training for police on the street. I am very concerned that it hasn't yet reached correctional facilities, and that's my goal, is to see that happen. NAMI is the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and it's a grassroots group of, there's 600 chapters nationwide, and we do a lot of advocacy for laws, and we work with, like in Connecticut, with Judiciary Committee and Public Health Committee and things to get various laws in place, such as in Connecticut, the Protect Act, which limited solitary confinement, and the Police Accountability Act the year before that. And just things that in general will reshape the criminal justice system more toward treatment where it's needed, as opposed to just purely punitive.
Thank you so much for that. I'm very sorry to hear about what happened to your son. That I can't imagine. As a father of two boys, I can't imagine. So I'm very sorry that you went through that. But thank you guys for introducing yourselves. And of course, like I said, I'm Corey Feasley. I'm a C4, C5 quadriplegic, and I've been injured for 17 years. And I'm just glad that all of us are here to talk about something that gets little headlines, or more so after the fact of an incident maybe occurring. And that's people with disabilities, a wide range of disabilities, who happen to find themselves committing crimes like any other person. But the treatment and the sentiment towards those who have disabilities is a little bit harder when it comes down to the criminal justice system. So we're going to just have a great conversation tonight. And I want everyone to feel free and be able to voice their thoughts and their opinions on each question. This is a topic that, quite frankly, is disturbing. And some of the things and cases that we'll go over, I hope that people who are viewing will be able to say to themselves, more has to be done. We can't just leave it up to politicians per se to just correct every single issue without somebody's voice being heard. With that being said, so lock them up and throw away the key is a common sentiment felt by the victim or the victim's family as they address a court concerning how severe they want the punishment for a criminal to be. People want justice to be served, and you can't blame them. However, when we determine that people who commit crimes are irredeemable and beyond repair, this inevitably leads to a lack of reform and abuse of power. Without oversight and sympathy, many who become incarcerated are forgotten, especially inmates with disabilities. According to a study done in 2016, it was reported that 2 out of 5 people incarcerated had at least one disability. With nearly half of people stating they have some form of disability, you have to wonder how equipped our criminal justice system is when it comes to handling one of the most vulnerable population groups. So that leads us to tonight's first discussion question. On July 28, 2017, the former US president addressed law enforcement. He spoke about how when someone has just murdered someone, you have to place them in the back of a squad car. He says, please don't be too nice. This would seem to imply that additional force should be applied out of fairness for the victim. Our predisposition for vengeance is a sentiment felt by many people, and the police are no different. Do you think law enforcement personnel engage in vigilantism when suspects are in their custody? And I'll give you an example of a case. So there's a gentleman named, his last name is Owensby, and this happened some time ago, like maybe in the last 3 or 4 years. And he told the police officer that he was paralyzed and that he was unable to leave his vehicle. Now, the nature of why he was stopped was due to his tents being too dark. And also, they saw that he had a child in the back seat who happened to be unrestrained. Now, the gentleman asked, for the white shirt to come, et cetera, et cetera. The cops started getting agitated and being upset with him. And eventually he said, hey, either you get out the car or I'm going to remove you myself. They end up dragging this man who happened to be paralyzed by his dreads and drug him and just sat him on the street without any type of other medical attention. In these situations, it would seem that police get aggravated at times when people appear to be uncooperative. Would you say sometimes the law takes matters into their own hands?
Up here, 2 weeks ago, they had an officer. He was transporting, you probably heard about it, transporting an inmate in the back of the van. And
Randy Cox.
Ended up breaking his neck. You know what I'm saying? That ain't right. He was already in custody. Now this man didn't lost his ability to walk and, do all the things. He paralyzed from the neck down. That ain't good. That ain't right. I ain't saying we got all bad officers, man, but they're out there, bro. Believe me, I know for a fact they out there.
For that scenario you're looking at, I'm going to go back to, and I got my brother's an ex-police officer, and I got several friends that are in corrections and law enforcement, and I just know them from the past. And honestly, they come across as being the nicest guys in the world, but I had also known that they're individuals, and in times they have difficulty showing and holding in emotions. And so with that being said, I despise what I heard you say. That is no circumstance somebody should be put under that duress. And recently, with the police being forefront, again, I'm in Minnesota. I'm 75 miles away from the George Floyd Shrine and probably several others that you've heard of in the news where the police were put on trial and brought up on charges. And that's something I think that happens to every force and in every city. There are people that go into something for the wrong reasons. Military has got people that go in that they say these people just want to kill. Law enforcement individuals, I think, are there to serve a better and higher cause, which is to bring peace in our community. With that being said, there are exceptions that are people out there. It's kind of one of those drag your friend down with you, where you have somebody that flies off the handle. You can't have a police officer grab another police officer and try to restrain them when you're trying to restrain somebody else. You're just not in that position to do that. So do I believe it happens? Yes. Have I read about it? Yes. Are there circumstances? Never should it ever come down to that. And again, I think too much is done on, you didn't listen to me, you disrespect me, almost like you're saying street justice sort of, where I didn't get my props and so I'm upset. You didn't do what I told you to do. I don't care what your reason is. And just today, I mean, out in the East Coast, I mean, you had a situation with the officers being shot and killed on a 911 call. So everybody's getting, I think, scared of everything else. The police officers don't want to be shot and killed. They have families, and so they're leaving, which means you're left with the people that want to go into law enforcement for the wrong reasons. and
Right.
it's to bust some heads up and stuff. So I'll leave it at that.
No, you're absolutely right. And that incident actually took place here in Connecticut, in Bristol, Connecticut, which is from where I am, probably, I don't know, 40-minute drive. So it's not, too far. And yeah, you're right. These incidences of injustice that police have been known to have, some history with, not all police departments, but then you have situations like these where, in this case, what we know now is that the officers were ambushed by this person. They were called by a fake 911 call. So it's kind of like everyone's on high alert. And I think the tension is thick in the air. How about you, Jonathan? Do you think that police officers engage in a sort of vigilante type of pursuit or attitude when apprehending suspects?
I mean, I would just echo what Scott says. I mean, you can't say that all police officers are bad, and you can't say that all police officers are good. I think what you can say is that the job in and of itself is extremely high pressured. There's a lot at stake. There's the safety of the community. There's the safety of the police officer, and so in that circumstance, if you don't have people who have solid character, who aren't there for the right reasons, or who are coming from a cultural or community background that doesn't look at people who are marginalized or minorities, or people who are engaging in criminal behavior as whole people, with their own backstories and kind of understanding what motivates people, right? That people who engage in crime are not all necessarily bad people. Sometimes they are desperate. Sometimes they need understanding. Sometimes they need coaxing into de-escalating a situation. It's not just, power through and arrest someone and show them who's boss kind of mentality. And, where do, people often talk about, talk about the government in this way. It's us versus the government. The government's all totally wrong. Where does the government come from, right? It comes from our communities. And so if our communities aren't healthy and treating people well and expressing empathy on a regular basis and understanding, then our police forces are going to have the same challenges. So I would just say it's a reflection on us.
Yeah, I think what you said is true, but you said something that I think makes a lot of sense, and Scott kind of alluded to this, is that, you said that, it's a high pressure job, right? Like there's a lot of weight. You're going to be called for an emergency, and then that emergency can turn into shots being fired. And that, also like part of our culture where we come from, like, you sign up for, one reason, to protect and serve. But also we can't negate that the way that you were brought up sometimes interacts with the way that you may handle a suspect. Jamal, like thus far, like in your practice, have you found it hard to argue a criminal case when maybe a client says the police were a little excessive for me, but there's a bit sometimes of a brotherhood of like maybe a he said, she said incident? How do you help people defend against being wrongfully or being a victim of excessive force when being apprehended?
Yeah, I'm glad you used that term, excessive force. I mean, because it goes back to your initial question, where this former president was basically employing his officers to use excessive force against individuals that they come encounter with if they committed a murder. I mean, at the point that you're arrested, you haven't you're accused of doing something, but you there's no way to do a murder at the time of your arrest. The labeling of being a murderer comes after you've been convicted in court. So at the point that person is being apprehended, they are innocent under the law and they should be treated as such. So any force that's used against that person should only be force that's reasonable under the circumstance. That's what the law provides for. And so anytime you go above and beyond that, because of your personal feelings about that person, you're usually entering the realm of using excessive force. And yes, I would say on a daily basis, I run into situations where I have people come into my office with claims of use of excessive force. And I think what needs to happen a lot of times is the officer is supposed to be the professional in the situation, right? They shouldn't go in there with a chip on their shoulder. And because this person didn't obey their order or answer them with what they feel is the proper respect, that then you're going to go and punch them in the face or drive them into the ground. I mean, the officer also needs to recognize that they're also not a medical professional. So if a person who is not convicted of a crime tells you that they are paralyzed in a car, you probably don't have the proper education to tell them otherwise. So maybe there needs to be something provided for where that person can get evaluated and see if that's the circumstance before you further hurt or kill them. To speak on the good officer, bad officer thing, here's my feelings on it. So we all have jobs and we've all worked at places and we know who the bad apples are at that place, right? And for a job that's so as important and dangerous as policing, to allow bad apples to go out and commit excessive force against other people and not call them back, to me, is to be complicit in that behavior. So I think those individuals should step up and speak against those people. And yeah, I do sympathize with the fact that it's a dangerous job that they signed up for. And at the point where it gets to become too much, or you don't think you can operate within the parameters of what the law provides, then it's probably something you should either go get counseling for or look for other employment. So that's my feelings on that.
Right. And playing devil's advocate, right? I think that what the former president expressed is a sentiment that is felt, I think, deeply inside of our minds and our hearts, right? So we'll use an example like there's an active shooter situation, right? And though the incidences, you don't necessarily rush in and you always apprehend a suspect who has committed a murder, but for the ones that they do catch in the act, right? Let's say they went on a long police chase, they apprehend the suspect, the person has to have their day in court. We'll take, for instance, the Aurora shooter in Colorado, right? In those moments, that intense feeling of being infuriated that you put the public at large, is that not something that somehow gets justified within the criminal justice system that allows police to get off if a suspect comes in a little bit roughed up due to the nature and the severity of the crime?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's morally okay and what's legally okay isn't always the same thing, right? So from a moral standpoint, you may say this person deserved it, but it may not be all right from a legal standpoint. Now, in the active shooter situation, something as tense and dangerous as that, the police are going to be given a wide range of discretion on how to handle that individual, right? Especially if this person has already contributed to the deaths of people. So when they come and interact with that person, there's not too much force that the law doesn't permit them to use in that particular situation. But to go back to your original question, yeah, unfortunately, what's morally okay, and let's say it's something different where he goes to arrest the officer. I mean, the officer goes to arrest them, and instead he spits in the officer's face. Now, most of us can understand that person getting roughed up for that, or it is a level of roughing up that the officer can do. But can the officer then pile drive his face into the concrete and snap his spine to where he can't walk anymore? That's probably going to be excessive force. So there is a balancing test there. So, I mean, those are all things that have to be considered.
And it's also, I think it's also important to note that, like in the example of your question, Corey, like the implication is not, I mean, yeah, in the speech saying what, if you see someone who's committed a murder and you're arresting them right afterwards, right, rough them up. Well, how often are police officers going to stumble upon a crime scene where someone has just committed a murder? That's when they're arresting them. I mean, he's talking about suspected murder. He's talking about gang members, all these assumptions that go in. So it's really kind of the whole, when you arrest people in general that you suspect of crimes, this is how you should treat them. That's kind of the assumption, I think, that is being made in that comment of don't be too nice.
You're absolutely right. And Scott, this is for you, Colin. You can follow up with it. Is this assumption that police will catch someone committing a crime fueling the idea of the maltreatment of somebody that's apprehended? Scott, that's for you.
I can say this with a short history lesson on a friend of mine. He joined in the corrections in Wisconsin. He was a bailiff. If anybody remembers the start of the show Cops, he was in the first year of episodes. And they actually, when he was working, and we got to see him on TV, which is why this is partial of it, when they brought in a cop killer. He killed a friend of a lot of people that are on the police force. They brought him in. I called my friend up probably 2 days later and said, "Hey, you want to tell me about that? We saw you on TV." And he said, "Well, this guy's a cop killer." And I said, "Oh." He said, "Yeah, well, you could probably guess. He fell down a couple times before he got to his cell." And that just was enough said to me to understand that there was more done to him because of the intense emotional state of the officers and the corrections people involved. I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying I can understand it. When people say of grotesque crimes, they think of murder and that. I go back to all of us mothers and fathers that are out there. If I was an officer and I came upon somebody abusing a child, that would touch me as much as any officer that has kids at home. And so I look at, the brutality of sometimes the want to do it is in question also, along with the training, is how do you got to push that aside. Again, as part of the job. And that comes with continuous educational training, not just train somebody once a year or something. Our world is changing so fast. Every aspect of it is getting to be emotional, more psychological. It's, pandemics are wearing on people's minds. And there are a lot of people that are now coming to the surface that were kind of hidden in our society, that are living in New York City on the streets, living in California and LA on the streets. And it's becoming more apparent that these people are less of criminals than they are of actually being having mental acuity problems. And, again, we have to figure out how to address that. And the police is one level, I think. Then you have to look at, okay, who else are we going to throw in the mix that will actually make a difference? And so there's some big questions still to be had about how we accept the handling of people. If you look back to the 80s, most movies, they're all about cops, getting revenge. Die Hard, Christmas movie, I guess. You have all these heroes in movies that usually do something to the villain worse than the villain ever did. And
Right.
people accept it, but people are accepting it because they're saying, hey, that guy deserved it.
You know
And the
what?
villains always have mental illness.
This is true. I think you and I, John, I gave that brief scenario kind of like a Batman Joker situation. Like Batman gets called by the police to go and stop crime, unrelenting at times. I mean, granted, he doesn't go as far as to kill them, but shows that, he's kind of like an anti-hero. He's like on one side of the law, and then he's on the next. Well, Colleen, if you could give us a little bit of feedback as far as just kind of like this culture of maybe a misguided belief that police have this like kind of ability to be able to take matters into their own hands.
I definitely think that the police on the street cannot be the jury and decide right then and there that the people need to be abused in some way or use brutality in some way in order to, if they have to arrest them, then they can do that. And they have safe ways to do that they should be trained in, or else they need more training. I really think that there needs to be more diversion in general, though, and that we need more community services in the front end so that we don't have so much crime at the back end, and then people do end up going to jail. Now, I've seen correctional officer brutality to the extreme, and I'm not sure where this conversation exactly is going to go, but that's what I'm interested in trying to diminish that CO brutality as well.
You're absolutely right, Aaron. We are going to touch base about that because, it's not just the police or your local sheriff. It also extends deeply into the prison system. And sometimes the way that we view brutality or revenge or retribution that one may feel like they have to carry out doesn't always extend into the physical force applied on somebody. Many times it does, but sometimes it's just watching a person deteriorate.
Yeah, just like sorry,
No,
Scott.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Just like Scott was saying, there's so many stresses placed on our police officers these days, and everyone really, but they need to keep that in check. And beyond just the training, we need to have mental health care for the officers so that they can control their anger, that they can control their biases and discriminatory natures if they have those. And I believe in some places are doing this across the country. There should be psychiatrists or at least psychologists in police departments and make it just less stigmatized to have some help, just have like regular meetings. I've heard this beginning to work. There's lots of pilot programs out there, but just a way for them to check in with their own mental health, because if they're that stressed out and they're going to snap when they are in a stressful situation on the street and begin to take matters in their own hands and become brutal in so many instances and let their discrimination show in so many ways, that's not why we have peacekeeping police force. That is what courts and juries are for. And if there is a sentence that the proper authorities deem should be placed, then it can in no way involve torture. They may have their freedom taken for a certain amount of time. And then during that time, they should have many programs available to help them rehabilitate and see what was the cause of whatever started with them in the first place. But the mental health care really has to go on both ends, because if you have out of control police officers and vigilantes, and it's so militarized these days, and they have so much, my own town was like trying to buy a tank in the past year. It's like, why do you need a tank? I mean, they ended up not getting it, but it's just the mentality has become so militarized in my mind.
Yeah.
And well, my son wasn't a victim so much of that on the street. Once he was in the courts for breach of peace and they did have him in jail, again, it was correctional officers that were the ones that were really out of control at that time. But in no way should it ever be in the hands to actually punish anyone that they suspect of a crime while they're on the streets without people having their day in court.
I think you're absolutely right. And, as Jamal could probably speak more to it about having that day in court. Jamal, is there anything that within the law currently that can protect individuals? Because when you're in custody sometimes and you get roughed up and you are like, you commit a crime, but now you're the victim of a crime being committed. And, it's gone to the extent where people have become disabled in the Department of Corrections, for example, was resurfacing that happened down in Florida, even though it happened about 5 years ago. A gentleman was in Florida's Department of Correction, wound up becoming paralyzed as a result of being slammed on his face. People who become injured, is there anything between the time they get arrested to the time they have their day in court where they can have any type of, protection to guard them from being hurt because they're vulnerable?
I mean, you have your constitutional rights. You have your Fourth Amendment rights that protect you prior to conviction, and your Eighth Amendment rights for against cruel and unusual punishment, which it sounds like Colleen's son was a victim of his rights being violated in that regard. And so you would hope that the officials who are in charge of policing you would abide by those. I mean, outside of that, you can make your complaints, you can file your lawsuits, but ultimately, there's not honestly a whole lot that if someone wants to violate your rights, that's that to stop them. You file your lawsuits after you make your complaints, you file your reports, but a lot of times, quite honestly, if we're going to be real on here, that's a bunch of hogwash. I mean, you file a complaint with the internal investigations. I've never seen them come back and say the officer was in the wrong. They always say that the officer was right and acted within our system, and it's because it's a money thing, right? Because they know this is heading towards a lawsuit, and so it's really unfortunate. But yeah, there needs to be something in place, and there needs to be a punishment, right? So if someone, including an officer or a CO, violates your constitutional right, there has to be some type of repercussions for that. They have to, maybe they lose some of their liberty, or they get arrested or put tax for that, and they have to spend some time away from their families. But if nobody's going to hold them to the flame, even in a lawsuit situation, it's not like it comes out of the officer's pocket. The city pays it, right? And then the officer at most may get put on a leave for a portion of time, and then he comes back to work. So, that's not a deterrent. I mean, if you want to change someone's behavior, you have to put something on the other side of bad behavior that deters them from engaging in that behavior. And quite honestly, that is just not the case these days.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something. And then you spoke about rights. So in terms of, moral, legal argument, how should a person's disability be factored in when they're sentenced?
Once you're sentenced, you're protected under Title II and 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which basically says that you're supposed to be afforded all the opportunities as someone who's not disabled in prison. And you're supposed to have things amended to your disability to allow you the same usages as everyone else that is there. And so that's what protects you as far as the law while you're in there. No one's to be subjected to, everyone is protected under the Eighth Amendment for cruel and unusual punishment. Right. And so those are the laws that protect you. Sometimes practically it doesn't happen though, because the prisons are overcrowded and they don't have the resources. So to change the whole layout of a prison to make it fair for everyone with a disability, sometimes this isn't feasible from a monetary standpoint. No, I haven't dived into what they monetarily have, so I can't speak to that as an expert. But that's the at least in writing, what they say is the issue.
Yeah, I think that's critical. Talking about the money that's involved, and that's something with us in the disability community we find really difficult. Whether it's trying to have access to get into a place of business or what have you. Business owners have to change the layout of their property, and there's sometimes a fear that it will cost a lot to do those things. But in order to have true reform, I think that's where we have to go to. But Scott, as we look at the issue of rights and how a person with a disability should be sentenced. I read about a gentleman's name was Clemente Aguirre down in Florida, and thank God for the Innocence Project, because he was sentenced to death for a murder that he did not commit. But the person who did commit the murder was the daughter of one of the women and the granddaughter of the other victim. But she had a severe type of impulsive, explosive type of disorder, which led to a man being imprisoned. And she, from everything that I researched, she was not charged for the crime. So when you look at a person with a disability committing a crime, how do you see it in terms of them being sentenced?
And that's a good question. And the first thing that comes to mind, especially when mentioning about the ADA Act, originally back in the 1970s, and then the addition of 504, and I think it was 1990 or 98 for the corrections part of it. You got to treat them exactly just like anybody else. And cost, unfortunately, would be something to look at. I called on a friend of mine that works with the correction systems over in Rush City at the state facility, and she's the assistant director of health. And I was asking her very simple questions. How are the people with disabilities treated? And what's the most common? And it's, they were talking about deafness, blindness. I said, what about prosthetic limbs? Those are weapons, aren't they? And she said, no, they can have them. Same thing with wheelchairs. And I said, I guess the follow-up question I had for her was, when looking at the state facility for Minnesota, the corrections, basically the count of prisoners and the tally of male, female, the tally of what they've done, basically the report for the year, I did not see one thing on a sheet of paper that even said disability. Now, you just mentioned, and I think it was a fantastic point, of putting a price tag to disability, which I believe most of us sitting around now understand it's immense. And if the people are saying, well, geez, we're paying so much for one person to be in jail, you're paying probably about triple to what, even more for a person that has a disability.
$100,000 a year.
Yeah,
$100,000 a year in some prisons. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not even being addressed because it's not in a budget. And that's because the sheet that I was reading off of is what they use for budgeting. It talks about race, it talks about religion, it talks about incarceration time, how long they're going to be there, all that. But I never saw anything connected to a disability. And now they were considering diabetes in it, HIV, anything that had to involve with that was needed medication for. But I'm like, therapy sessions cost money, and there's got to be people, well, like I said before, having accidents in the prison that are getting injured, and so those are expensive, and they need a place, they need security, they need, well, just a lot of things that I didn't think about. But my point of that is, when we get in front of people and say we want to be equal, I would say you'd have to look at somebody with a disability just like anybody else and saying, okay, it may have been a crime of passion. Somebody defending themselves is a crime of passion. Any number of things can fall in line with that. So if we look at that scenario of, the handicapped person with a disability didn't have any money because of a medical emergency and they need food, we are set up for that as far as our food shelves and for as many times as people say that I didn't know who to talk to, if you really look hard enough, there is a way to contact anybody and get some kind of attention. I know that's not always, but for the foremost, we have so many programs set up to help people in need, more or less nowadays, that I would look at as being, if you did the crime, you do the time, is, I don't think that far off from, doesn't matter the reasoning behind it. What is that phrase I'm looking for? Anyways, it's just that basically there's no good reason to break the law.
Understood. John, what about you? Like, how do you think disability should be factored in? And as a person with a disability, do you empathize with people more who commit crimes?
Well, I remember in college, I took a film class, and one of the old films we watched was, I forget what it was called, but it was basically a crime drama about a serial killer who would kill children, right? And this guy is cornered. All the organized criminal gangs kind of ally up with the police to find this person who's terrorizing the community, and they finally find him and corner him, and they're about to kill him. Street justice, and he gives this speech, and he says, "I can't control what I do. I don't know how to stop. You know, if you can help me, help me. But I don't want to be doing what I'm doing." And this was a revolutionary concept that was illustrated in this film. Is that when we think about committing crimes and people who commit crimes, perhaps the vast majority of them have some kind of disability, whether if it's not physical, then it's mental. And disability is such a broad thing, right? Your environment can be the origin of your disability. It has nothing to do with you necessarily. It can there are so many factors that come up that construct disability. I use a wheelchair. If my environment has ramps and push handles to open the doors for me, I'm not disabled in that scenario. I'm able to maneuver and explore my environment. But as soon as there are barriers that I can't overcome, then that becomes a disability for me. So thinking about that, especially with mental disability, and I would love to hear Colleen's perspective on this. The concept that police, are constantly traumatized and need constant therapy. I haven't heard that perspective before, and I think that's really key. But looking at the whole criminal justice system as a mental rehabilitation project, I think is really important to think about.
Colleen, before you jump in, I just want to say, Jonathan, I think that I think you're onto something, because having a mental disability when committing a crime, trying to factor that in is important just as much as factoring in the way that police communities, after maybe they undergo a psychological evaluation, because then they too can now have a mental disability because of all the things that they may have seen. Colleen, please answer. I would love to hear what you have to say on that.
Well, I think it's shown and proven, and SAMHSA would agree, that 50% of people with a mental illness aren't even aware that they have one. There's a very poor insight. And so to automatically blame people that they're not themselves going for treatment or not able to control their behavior in all ways. And additionally, another 50%, again, and some of it overlaps, of people with a serious mental illness have a substance misuse disorder. And that can cause some odd behaviors. Now, you may say, is that someone's fault that they have it themselves? Well, once you have that, and it is a lot in the genes, and it is very correlated with having a mental health issue, then I don't think you can say that they're 100% responsible for your actions. Now, you need society to be safe, but those people need to be more in treatment than they need to be punished. And I think we need to have compassion for them, and accommodations made, just like you have accommodations for the wheelchairs or for the other things. It may be difficult and it may be a money factor, but I think it's necessary, and I think our laws already protect those rights.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I would just add another point to that, which is, if you consider internationally that the United States overwhelmingly, from considering wealthy and industrialized nations, has by far the largest imprisoned population. That's not because our population in general is that more intentionally criminal, right? Like, is there something about being an American, a human being living on American soil, that makes us more morally corrupt? I mean, is that what we're saying? Or is it that we have environmental accessibility issues related to mental health, related to social services, related to how we treat each other and how we care for each other, that is the source of the problem?
There's definitely that. And when you have someone with mental illness, and such a large proportion of them are in jails because they can't always follow the rules as well. And once they're in a prison system, then they stay in longer because they, again, can't follow the rules as well, and they get discriminated against, and just the environment that it is currently increases their mental illness, especially if they're in solitary confinement for any length of time. Yes. So then when it comes time that they are released, whether you have mental illness or not, if you don't even have like excellent reentry programs in place, then there's just going to be all that high level of recidivism happening. So it's such a you need like a whole arms wrap around the whole problem, and so many segments of it It has to be a whole approach. And I think it's difficult to do, like, fix this one little piece and then you'll see improvements. Like, it all is so integrated together.
Yeah.
The justice system, it just needs a whole overhaul. And, where they do it in places like Germany and Norway, it's a rehabilitatory type of program that they have for criminal justice. And they have more community services in the front end again. And so it's possible, but for some reason in America, we became so militarized and so weaponized, our police officers and the system in general, that it takes a whole mind shift. And there are people working toward getting some of those other models and having experiments. We've done that in Connecticut. With the TRUE program and with the Worth program in some of the prisons. So there's hope, but I think it takes a long time to right that ship.
Yeah, I agree with both of your viewpoints. Even in Australia, 50% of incarcerated individuals have some type of intellectual disability. And because programs and services aren't rendered while people are young, even to just explain how they can socially integrate into a society that pretty much thinks that they're a burden and looks down on them, it makes them an easy target. And the reason why I bring up about how we view people is because back in 2002, the Supreme Court had a ruling about people with intellectual disabilities are not eligible for the death penalty. It was a case of Atkins versus Virginia. The crime actually was committed 6 years prior to in 1996, where Atkins and another gentleman robbed a military personnel and wind up shooting the guy 88 times. And so this crime is horrific. I mean, there's great outrage when you think about someone that is innocent, not doing anything to anyone, but yet somebody takes advantage. Now, the two perpetrators of the crime happen to be engaged in alcohol, smoking, and whatnot before they decided to kill him. The problem in this situation is when Jones, which is the last name of one of the defendants, decided to turn state witness, he spoke against Atkins. Atkins, at the time, they used terms like mental retardation. They looked at his IQ score, which was about 56. He had numerous other offenses against him, but he didn't necessarily understand fully, I think, the severity of the crime that's committed. Now, it doesn't negate what he did, but the way that the prosecution worked against him, it turned out that after he spent time on death row, when this decision was made, it didn't stop states from being able to deem who is intellectually disabled, right? So you have a universal decision on one hand, but then states have the ability to still allow people to receive the death penalty regardless, right? It was, I think, 19 out of 30 states. And I think the problem is, in whose hands do we then place the ability to deem a person mentally unfit? Like, who's actually taking care of that? Is it medical staff? Is it the court system? We spoke about that earlier. Jamal said it, like, when somebody's in police custody, if they happen to be injured, medical aid needs to be rendered to them, not by the CO, even if they have first aid training. But it turns out that the prosecutor in this case with Atkins was coaching their personal witness, and because of a technicality, he ended up getting life, and they took him off of death row. And I wonder, in that situation, if they took advantage of his disability, him not understanding how the court may necessarily work. Maybe he's not the one who pulled the trigger, but he was present during the course of the robbery. And Jamal, I know that you had looked at the case. In a situation like that, how can the victim not feel like they got some type of justice, regardless if the person was noted to have like a disability?
Processing the question. So in the Atkins v. Virginia case, so Justice Stevens, I think in his opinion, it was pretty brilliant. And it only spoke to the scope of whether they could be penalized by death, right? And basically, what Justice Stevens says is that we can't subscribe the same amount of moral culpability to someone who's suffering from a mental illness as we can to someone who's not. He also says that there's too many mitigating factors that come along with your mental illness that could weigh into how that person presents in trial, for example. So that person may have an affect on their face that the jury could deem as that person being heartless or not caring about what's going on, or that person's ability to assist his attorney at trial or in preparation of the case. In this particular case, it wasn't just that his co-defendant pointed the finger; they pointed the finger at each other. But what happened was, because of the mental illness, one party was able to present better than the other party. And the jury bought into that, as well as being coached through leading questions that were permitted to come in and things of that nature. And then, so what the court basically said is that, we can't sentence people to death who have a mental disability just because of those things alone, right? So we're going to take the death penalty off the table for those people. In the dissenting voice, though, I think it speaks to everything else. So the dissenting voice basically says every situation is different. And so for every case, that jury who's more familiar with the case because they're hearing it should make the decision on whether that person should get the death penalty or not. All right. Obviously, there's a dissenting voice they lost, but I think that's what happens in most other cases, right? And that's what needs to happen. I think absolutely we have to take into account that if a person has a mental disability, that how that factors into the particular case. So sometimes there's situations like, I think his name is Scott brought up, where the disability shouldn't make a difference as to how he's punished, right? And other times there's situations where absolutely it makes a difference in how we should penalize this person, right? And so, yeah, and the law does provide for things like that, right? There's things called insanity pleas. There's things that, which is probably, a little insensitive as I'm thinking of the terminology of it right now, but there's also things called irresistible impulses that can be brought up as defenses. All these things are things that I've brought up at trial in a court setting, and I've won one. I mean, I think about one client who, in all other realms of life, he's fine. He stopped taking his medication. Nicest kid in the world. He stopped taking his medication. One night he's walking to the convenience store. He decides that these voices are talking to him. He steals the old lady's car. He runs to a graveyard and he hits a 13-year-old girl. Right. So, now if completely able-minded person did something like that, I feel that they should get a different consequence than someone who's suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, right? That has to be accounted for. And that's what happened in that case, right? So that person, had to spend some time in Whiting to get, correctional, get rehab, versus just penalizing him, and he doesn't have that. Now he has those resources to help tame his paranoid schizophrenia and reinforce the importance of staying on your meds, right? So, I hope I spoke to your question. I kind of
that definitely hits the nail on the head, because at that point in time, committing a crime, having considered his mindset and his mind state, I think is very important. And that, like you say, in any other setting with the right precautionary measures would have kept him out of trouble, right? But in this situation, because of being off of medication, so something else intervened instead of, like Colleen said, exacerbating the situation, placing somebody in solitary confinement and expecting that to be the ultimate deterrent. I think in our culture, we spend a lot of time trying to, punish people so severely. And I'm not by any means advocating like everybody ought to be free, but we think like, punishment fits every scenario that a person when they commit some type of offense, and that somehow is always going to be the exit strategy to help people become better. And it just does not always work. And I think more and more people are beginning to see that. Now, Colleen, I'll direct this question to you. Question 3. You spoke about trying to get things like righting the ship, essentially, between what happens between law enforcement and the community and people. And you talked about how your son passed away in the care of the correctional facility in the Department of Corrections. How do you think, and you spoke about advocacy, how do you think relationships can be repaired between law enforcement and the community at large?
Well, I think we need transparency and accountability, definitely. If there's a lot of cover up all the time, then the public's not going to trust the people who are running the criminal justice system, whether they're on the street or in the correctional facility. If there's mistakes made or brutality is done, if they would just own up to it and try to use that to make the system better. I kind of see it from both sides, because my son was a victim, and the one officer was convicted of assault, though not homicide. But even so, I don't want that officer to be tortured, or the other people who were responsible. I don't want them to be tortured or mistreated. I want them held accountable and transparent. And I would drop everything if they would just say that this was horrible the way this happened. Let's just be honest about it and see what we can all do to work together to change the system. Now, I think that's probably, some kind of rainbow dream of mine that something like that would ever happen. But I think that transparency and accountability goes a very long way toward building trust. And also, I think more education would beget more trust as well. Because if you're educated on people with disabilities and you are trained in how to handle them and reasons why they may be behaving a certain way, then I think you would have more compassion. I think education begets compassion, and you would automatically be treating them in a more humane manner. In Connecticut, we did pass some laws that have some oversight over some of these systems now, and I'm hoping that that transparency and accountability will eventually lead to better relationships between people who need help, people who may commit crimes for other reasons, and people who are responsible for keeping the public safe and also rehabilitating those that may need it. I just think it's such us and them mentality all the time that is kind of at the base of the problem.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I don't think it's I think the dream is the reality, right? I think what you're saying is the absolute truth. How to get there, it's just filled with competing thoughts. John, how about yourself? How do you think we can mend, police in the community? How do you think relationships can be kind of tethered back together?
Exactly what Colleen said. And I just want to say, Colleen, how amazing and impressive, and that your response to what happened with your son is to say the police need more help. That is such a transformational perspective that we all need, when we suffer at the hands of crime, to understand that. So I just applaud you for that, and want to cheer you on in fighting for that. And I think that's the right perspective. We need mental health for people to keep them out of crime, but if it's not being addressed on both ends, then we're not solving the problem.
Spinning our wheels.
Yeah, exactly. Scott, how about you? How do you think we can bring this thing together?
I think that's exactly the terminology we should use, is together. I think words like groupthink and things like that are thrown out a lot. But I'll give you a circumstance. A state that has the death penalty, when Ted Bundy was put to death, the entire state, 1 hour before his electric chair was used, people turned off their lights to make sure there was enough juice to kill Ted Bundy. Recently, a school shooter in that same state was just given life instead of death by the jury. And they asked the parents that were there, is justice served that he's gotten life instead of the death penalty? Some were saying yes, others would say it doesn't matter. There is no justice for what happened. But they did say that they hope the prison has its own form of justice that will play out for that young man. So there's two scenarios of people killing a lot of people, and how the group thought of it back in Ted's time and how they think of it now, where they said, we shouldn't think of the death penalty as the only option, the most supreme thing for everything. Not an eye for an eye, but what can this guy contribute to the future of hopefully corrections and finding out? They deemed him sane and capable of standing trial. So, short version is, I guess we all have to think this together and keep talking about it, because the society is changing and our attitudes change.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. And, that was like the nature of question one, what I was getting at, because I've met somebody and we kind of got on that subject, and we were talking about like people who commit rape, etc. And he referred in a derogatory way that he felt like the person really deserved the same type of punishment he inflicted on a victim, that he himself should undergo that same treatment. And it doesn't do anything to necessarily solve the issue. From a legal standpoint, Jamal, what have you seen where police in a community come together, just even here in the state of Connecticut?
What have I seen to try to help it? I do see where police will come and visit the schools, try to get a positive relationship with the children, like early on, before they reach those more formative years. I can't say that I think that's the answer. I think that could be something in addition to more along the lines of the type of things that Colleen spoke about. I think transparency is going to be super important. And I've already said, I think that accountability is important. There's no reason to change your behavior if no one's going to hold you accountable. And then also there needs to be an understanding that, you're the police. I mean, there's very few independent people or citizens who have the force response of what a police officer would have, right? So you don't have to prove you're the toughest guy. You have to walk into it knowing that and being secure in yourself, and not have to prove at that moment on that block that you're the toughest person, you know? And so I think things like that. I mean, there's a number of things. I'm a Black male. I can speak to it from a race perspective. I mean, in racism, there's a large gap that needs to be had. But accountability and transparency would be a really good start.
Well, I feel like they got to get out there and they got to beat these streets, man. They got to beat these streets and get to know their community, man. You know what I'm saying? If they don't do that, they want to sit around and ride around in their car all day. That ain't gonna work. You know, that ain't gonna work. So they got to get out here and, you know, like I said, beat these streets, talk to neighbors and, you know, people in the neighborhood. Because like right now, around here where I'm at, I mean, it's crazy, man. You know, these young boys is not playing no games. And all it is, they ain't got no direction, man. It ain't like how it was when I came up. We had places to go play basketball at night. You know what I'm saying? They ain't got nothing like that.
I agree with everybody's viewpoint. You know, this issue is not an overnight fix. And as society continues to change, we have to change along with it. It's kind of like we look at the Constitution as a basis for many arguments, but that's why there's amendments, because what was done in their time period isn't done now. And the way that we enforce laws, the language that we use in order to interpret different cases, different crimes have changed. The nature of crimes have changed. What was maybe morally not acceptable in one era is morally acceptable in another. What was legal at one point in time was illegal now. And then so we do have to change with the times. But the most important aspect that we all have to go into when we evaluate these things is really what's going on in the mindset of people. As beautiful as everybody has put their perspectives into words, it's very difficult when you're on a planet that inhabits 7.5 billion people with different viewpoints, mindsets, and opinions. But I think this is one of is a great starting point for people who tune in and people who view. Before we close, does anybody else have any more thoughts to add?
I just want to say that I hope, you know, as we say that the police should be responsible and know that they're the toughest people. So, you know, to take that control responsibly, that we can also emphasize that the toughest people aren't afraid to see a therapist every week. You know, that's not a sign of weakness, but that is a sign of strength. It's like, yeah, I'm going to therapy after my session or after my shift. You know, that if that could become like a regular part of our evening cop shows, you know, like the psychologist is like seen as a valuable asset as opposed to an annoyance, or, you know, something like that. I think that's a really important shift to make happen.
I'll just say this is a really powerful platform, and I thank you guys for having me. And you know, anything I can do to assist as you guys go along in the future, I would love to do that. It was great hearing everyone's perspective, and I enjoyed myself today.
Thank you, Scott or Colleen. You guys got any thing that you want to add to this conversation?
No, I think we've discussed it on many different levels. That you know, need just more looking into in the future for people to take into consideration that, you know, you come from our standpoint of wheelchair bound. People don't think we have a lot to say about, you know, society because we're in our own form of our lives. Right. And actually, we are still just as scared and worried about everything else. And our input sometimes, well, I think it's an observational viewpoint that, again, I don't think people really listen to us as much as we have, because we have a lot of input about, again, therapy, overcoming adversity, anger, emotion, just like everybody else, and sometimes intensify. You know, but as I'll tell you in closing, my brother left the force, and when I asked him, he just said, "It was not meant for me." I mean, he got to the point he realized it was not something he wanted to continue, and that was it. And so I always applauded him and said, "Hey, you know, you realize your limitations. Thank you." I mean, that's, you know, why keep him in there when he ends up, you know, that's to me, police service is a job you can't do and hate. If you hate your job, you just can't do that. It's going to come out some way or another, and it's probably not going to be good. But otherwise, I thank everybody for their input as well. I've learned a lot. You know, just by listening, different sides of the country, East Coast, I'm in the Central, fly over state, but we've had more police drama in my state than most states can even imagine, and we're still going through it. Minneapolis police officers are leaving in droves, and I admire the ones that when they interview, they said, "Why are you staying?" They said, "This is my home. My house is down there. This my aunt's over there." They don't leave because the job got tough. They're staying because the job is tough, and they feel only they can do it. So I applaud those people, and I hope there's more of them.
Awesome. Colleen, how about yourself?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that, I'm late to the realization of all this discrimination and systemic racism and the systemic discrimination that's been going on just until it kind of reached my own household about maybe 5 years ago, and I'm still learning a lot, and I'm learning a lot about what can make the system better. And I'm recognizing more and more the people that have had to deal with this their whole lives. And, it kind of makes me ashamed that I was not as aware as I am now. But the point I want to make on that is that there's so many millions and millions of people like me who have not had any kind of brush with the criminal justice system, until maybe something drastic happens, like what happened in my life. But we all need to just keep talking and keep educating and keep making it known that this kind of discrimination exists and that there's solutions out there so that we can all come together. But I think the great majority of people aren't even aware that it's a problem. So this platform is something that is, I think, really on the right track. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. What I've learned from everyone is, we recognize that the job of policing is a high pressure job, and thoughts and emotions and real feelings come into it when apprehending people. And it's not always necessarily just an easy thing to do, especially when you may culturally come from a place where you're used to being roughed up, or you manhandle people, or your thought process is like, hey, look, the harder I punish you, the more of a deterrent that it can be. And so though they have to be more responsible and what have you, we also have to view them in the light of that they are humans as well, but it does not give them a license to carry out their own form of judgment on a person. I think it's important to be a professional. Don't confuse your morals with legal rights of citizens when somebody's suspected of committing a crime. Advocacy and community engagement is important. Transparency equals trust, and we got to understand that the accountability creates a forgiving heart on both sides of the criminal justice system. And thank you guys for participating in our More Than Walking video podcast discussion. Stay tuned in and join us next month and sign up for the More Than Walking newsletter at morethanwalking.com to learn more about the topic we will cover next. Until next time, remain encouraged, stay hopeful, and above all else, stay aware. Take care, everyone.